Is Mahmoud Khalil's arrest justified? Why was Trump promoting Teslas at the White House? And the Department of Education cuts half its employees. For them, school's out forever! Then more on this week's America Uncovered headlines. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. There are a lot of things going on in the world right now. Trade wars, culture wars, wars. There's something far more important to the day-to-day lives of every American that the dishonest mainstream media is barely covering. A Cheeto, shaped like the Pokemon Charizard, was auctioned for nearly $88,000. Just look at this thing, it's perfect. Even down to the fact that this fire-type Pokemon is made from a flaming hot Cheeto. If someone finds a vegan Cheeto in the shape of Venusaur, I'm pretty sure there won't be any atheists anymore, because that would be proof of intelligent design. And if you're wondering why I think this story is so monumentally newsworthy, it's because it's the first Cheeto joke in a decade that doesn't involve Trump. Speaking of the president, remember last week when Trump declared that illegal protests at schools wouldn't be tolerated and agitators will be arrested and possibly deported? Well, Trump has announced that recent Columbia graduate Mahmoud Khalil, a member of the pro-Hamas Columbia University Apartheid Divest protest group, was arrested by ICE over pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, anti-American activity, and says this arrest is the first of many.
I think we ought to get them all out of the country. They're troublemakers, they're agitators, they don't love our country. We ought to get them the hell out.
This has shocked many, because when's the last time you saw a president keep a promise? Someone ought to check the temperature in hell right now. Khalil, an ethnic Palestinian born and raised in Syria, is being held in a detention center in Louisiana and is facing possible deportation despite being a legal permanent resident who's married to an American citizen. However, a federal judge in New York has temporarily blocked efforts by the Trump administration to deport him. So yet another pending case. And for every job cut by DOGE, the overall employment numbers are probably unaffected considering all the lawyers being hired because of the Trump administration. Protests have broken out demanding Khalil be released, with many criticizing this move as a clear violation of the First Amendment. Only the situation is not as clear as some make it out to be. Legally speaking, I mean. Some are justifying Khalil's arrest, citing a clause in U.S. Code 1182 that states aliens are inadmissible to the United States if they engage in any activity, a purpose of which is the opposition to, or the control or overthrow of, the government of the United States by force, violence, or other unlawful means. Engaging with politics these days requires more knowledge of obscure lore than a hardcore Lord of the Ring fanatic. So, was Khalil opposing or trying to overthrow the government? Well, the pro-Palestinian group that Khalil was a leader of describes himself as Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization, and they back armed resistance by Hamas. So he was not opposing or trying to overthrow the government. Others are saying that the First Amendment doesn't apply to Khalil since he isn't actually a citizen of the United States.
This is not about free speech. This is about people that don't have a right to be in the United States to begin with. No one has a right to a student visa. No one has a right to a green card, by the way.
Yes, the age-old who is actually covered by the Constitution debate. The Department of Homeland Security announced Khalil's arrest was in support of Trump's executive order prohibiting anti-Semitism, saying that he led activities aligned to Hamas, a designated terrorist organization, which is pretty vague. Leading activities aligned to Hamas might be repugnant to many, but it isn't in of itself illegal. As I said last week, the First Amendment allows protests, but it doesn't allow you to break the law while doing so. You can't chainsaw someone's Vespa in half while shouting, "Bring back the McRib." Bring back the McRib. But the details of what specific illegal activity Khalil engaged in aren't clear, at least not from the DOJ. Some netizens have pointed to things like this barricading of a Columbia University building, and this occupation of a Barnard College library as the illegal activities of Khalil and his group. But since Columbia University is private property, it's really up to them to decide if they want to oust an occupation. And if they chose not to press charges, technically the occupation isn't illegal. Until more details are released, we won't really know if Khalil's arrest was justified. What do you think about it? Is it a violation of the First Amendment or eliminating a threat to our country? The only thing that's certain is this going to lead to a lot more employed lawyers. Speaking of soulless bloodsuckers, Russian President Vladimir Putin, who looks like Nosferatu before he became a mustached vampire. Ukraine has agreed to an immediate 30-day ceasefire negotiated by the U.S., assuming Russia accepts the plan. This followed the U.S. freezing security assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. However, this freeze was lifted as a condition of Ukraine accepting the plan. Putin has said he agrees in principle with the ceasefire, but says more discussions are needed. Hopefully, Trump's recent threats of putting sanctions on Russia will give them the push they need to stop the war, even if just temporarily. That would be nice. Not just to see a reprieve from the bloodshed, but a story involving Russia and someone being pushed, and it's not through a window. And after the break, Donald Trump, Tesla salesman. Welcome back. X faced multiple outages earlier this week as a result of a massive cyber attack. In a post, Elon Musk claimed X gets attacked every day, but this was done with a lot of resources. Either a large coordinated group and/or a country is involved. That's terrible that they only targeted X. Look, I'm not a fan of companies getting cyber attacked, especially from hostile foreign countries. But if it had to happen, could you imagine if for even just 20 minutes, all social media in the nation went down? Pretty wild hearing about a cyber attack on the guy that sells cyber trucks, which, by the way, was one of the Teslas in front of the White House on Tuesday, where Trump made a show out of purchasing a Tesla. Not a Cybertruck, though, since Trump supports the police and doesn't want to drive around in a vehicle that looks like it's gonna battle RoboCop. Trump said he was doing this to support Musk after Tesla shares plunged, suffering its biggest loss in 5 years. Turns out when the face of a company aligns himself with one of the most polarizing people on the planet, that can hurt sales, among other things. Some complained that Trump making such a spectacle of supporting a company was a blatant violation of the Hatch Act, a 1939 law that limits political activities of federal employees. However, the Hatch Act specifically doesn't apply to the president or vice president. And even if it did, you know Trump would just sign an executive order and then immediately plug how great the company is that made the pen he used to sign it. Trump also announced he would label violence against Tesla dealers as domestic terrorism.
When you heard an American company, especially a company like this, supplies so many jobs that others are unable to do, when you do that, those people are going to go through a big problem when we catch them.
Trump also announced a new department of the U.S. military that would defend Cybertrucks and X from cyber attacks, the Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad. And now, on to the tariff war. On this week's wild episode of the roller coaster that we're all strapped in on and can't seem to escape from, fears over Trump's tariffs led to a market sell-off that saw losses of $4 trillion in value from the S&P 500's peak just a month ago, which, as an expert on finances, I can confidently say is not ideal. Not financial advice, by the way. The provincial government of Ontario and Canada suspended its planned supercharge of electricity to the U.S. after Trump threatened to double steel and aluminum tariffs from 25% to 50%. It's like Trump's policy advisor is that scene from the 1989 Batman movie where Michael Keaton yelled, "You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts!" The base 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports to the U.S. took effect, hitting Canada, the European Union, and Australia. And even though Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called the tariffs unjustified, he said Australia won't retaliate. I guess they don't want to get nuts, lest their nut exports also get tariffed. However, the EU and Canada did retaliate against Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, with the EU targeting $28 billion worth of U.S. goods and Canada placing a 25% tariff on nearly $21 billion worth of U.S. products. Not to be outdone, Trump threatened a 200% tariff on champagne and wine from Europe. Because we don't need no pretentious European booze. We got plenty of classy all-American spirits like moonshine and toilet wine. That's what class tastes like. While this is all causing uncertainty, Trump says the U.S. economy faces a period of transition. Trump is okay with Americans paying the price for something to transition? Wow, it's the most progressive thing I've ever heard from him. He clarified that this is all leading to a future where America is more self-reliant.
Hey, look, what I have to do is build a strong country. You can't really watch the stock market. If you look at China, they have a 100-year perspective.
Yeah, you can't watch the stock market. I mean, what type of president would ever take credit for things that happen in the stock market? That would definitely be short-sighted. But while things are chaotic now, could this be worth it in the long run if these tariffs encourage the U.S. to become more self-reliant and it revitalizes manufacturing? In the America First investment policy, the Trump administration states that economic security is national security. Only time will tell. Department of Education staff in Washington, D.C. were told on Tuesday to vacate the premise by 6 p.m. and that the offices would be closed on Wednesday for security reasons. This was shortly before it was announced that 1,300 employees were immediately laid off and that the DOE is potentially looking to lay off up to 50% of its workers. Education Secretary Linda McMahon says this is the first step towards shutting the department down, though that would require an act of Congress. Now, public education in America over the last few decades hasn't been doing so good. You can tell because I said good and not well. Some agree that public education funding needs an overhaul, but think more federal involvement is the answer. While McMahon writes that she and Trump's visions are aligned to bring education back to the states, give parents more power, and to not let their children's education be corrupted by political ideologies, special interests, and unjust discrimination. So, will this work? Again, only time will tell. There are rarely simple answers for complex problems. Nothing in life is perfect. Well, except that flaming hot Cheeto shaped like a charizard. Before you go, be sure to check out this other episode of America Uncovered that the algorithm knows is best for you. Don't question the algorithm. It knows if you do. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thank you for watching America Uncovered.